Hello, I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Morrow Memorial Library tonight. My name is Hillary. I'm the Adult Services Librarian, and I'm very excited to introduce you tonight to Cashman Care Prince, who is the Norwood Historical Society's president, who will be talking to us about F. Holland Day. So Cashman, take it away, it's yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this lovely Monday evening. One of the great illusions of Zoom is that we are all together some beautiful place. Of course, the reality is you're probably going to wind up hearing from my dog, who will decide to announce herself during the middle of this talk. So I'm going to apologize for that in advance. We are going to talk tonight about F. Holland Day, Daring to Love. I'd like to thank Morrow Memorial Library for the opportunity to give this talk, and I'd like to thank the Friends of Morrow Memorial Library for making it possible. And now I just have to learn how to advance my slides. There we go. I first gave this talk 2 years ago when we marked 50 years on from Stonewall. At the time, I opened with quotes I had just read in the newspaper, and while it's now 2 years on, it remains relevant. Here are two observations from Yuval Noah Harari in The Guardian back in June of 2019. In 1969, when the New York police raided Stonewall Inn and encountered unexpected resistance from LGBT protesters, homosexuality was still criminalized in most countries. Even in more tolerant societies, venturing out of the closet was often akin to social and professional suicide. In the United States, in 2019, the average Republican today holds far more liberal views on LGBT issues than the average Democrat held in 1969. Now, while there are visible and out leaders of countries and of global corporations, this is a recent phenomenon. Past performance is no guarantee of future success, as financiers advise. Or to return to Harari, and this is the second pull quote you see below, history rarely moves in a straight line. And I do hold that that pun is intended in his original. These are timely reflections as we think about Fred Holland Day in Boston and the world of the 1890s through 1920s, the world that he inhabited. In a sense, this talk begins from the question, was Fred gay? Spoiler alert, the answer is, well, it depends. How do you define your terms? And what do you count as proof? And I'm going to go over some of this in more detail. In this question, there's also the issue of outing someone. Publicly declaring someone else's sexuality is a difficult subject, and many people have different stances on it. If it's a politician working against LGBTQ rights or individuals, or it's a public figure who enjoys queer support, but not also sharing in the agonies and the difficulties, many argue that outing is for the greater good. Fred Holland Day was neither. So outing him would be more along the lines of outing a private individual. Who are we to name and expose his private life? Also, let's be honest, these questions are much more difficult to answer for historic figures because of changing mores and changing language. Factor in Day's own reticence and the difficulty increases. What follows draws on the works of many scholars, including Dr. Patricia Fanning, Day's most recent and so far most thorough biographer. I rely on the work of earlier scholars. I'm trying to contextualize Day in a larger historic worldview and also in social currents of the times. So let's begin with some of that social cultural context. Fred Holland Day was born July 23rd, 1864. This is during the last year of the US Civil War. If you're keeping score at home, it's the same day as the Battle of Kernstown, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. It's one day after General Sherman took Atlanta. Abolition was a strong current in Boston and Boston area thought and society. It was a fractious time with many lives being lost over the fight for freedom and emancipation. This advancement towards greater democracy and the restoration of the Union was also a time of war and expropriation of Native American land. Norwood saw both an increase in the wealth of the Day family and an influx of poor immigrants, many factory workers, who took up residence in what is now South Norwood. And I should say I'm alighting 1864 to 1872 when this region was still known as South Dedham, for the purposes of simplicity. An 1879 trip that Fred Holland Day took with his mother, Anna Smith Day, to Denver brought the 15-year-old into contact with different landscapes and peoples. This is a carte de visite of him at that time as an approximately 15-year-old, almost 15-year-old. It's about a month before his birthday. Fred was exposed to humanitarian values at home and in his travels, and it seems he embraced them. Pam Roberts puts it this way: Day was born into a privileged family which took its social responsibilities seriously, but practically, seemingly from natural inclination and habit rather than from any wealth-induced guilt. Day inherited this trait to help, to support and mentor, to make his time and wealth available to realize the potential in others less fortuitously economically placed. At the same time, Fred was strongly individualistic. In the words of Verna Possever Curtis, echoing Roberts, quote, Day stood out as an individual and followed his convictions. Supported by family and friends, he did not compromise. In addition, he was democratic in his approach to ideas and people and proved a generous mentor to many. From their reports, we start to discern a young man marked by his mother's progressive views on race and her embodiment of universalist values of acceptance, responsibility, and community. Other incidents and anecdotes support a picture of a man staunch in, quote, his loyalty and dedication to his home and the ideals and achievements of his country, end quote, marked by tradition and his native New England, and one who embraced his role as an inspiration to friends and younger colleagues. These values stayed with him for the rest of his days, and given the means to march to his own drumbeat, he could combine these traits with a strong individualist streak. Now, I must acknowledge, this is a different portrait of Fred Holland Day from the journalism of his lifetime and of a lot of 20th century scholarship. Curtis summarizes, according to journalistic accounts of his day, well known for their sensation and hyperbole, Day exhibited wild behavior and lived a bizarre and erratic life. He's been frequently characterized as eccentric, including in the title of Estelle Jussome's 1981 biography, which sought to restore Fred to a rightful place in the history of photography. One might question how successful it was at that. Writing in 1951, Rollins and Parrish wrote that Boston has seldom nurtured personalities odder than Amy Lowell and Fred Holland Day, or more engaging than Louise Imogen Guiney and Louis Arthur Holman. If you don't know, Amy Lowell, part of the Lowell Brahmin dynasty, was the, I believe, great aunt of the now better known poet Robert Lowell. She herself was a poet. She was a biographer of John Keats. She knew Day. They were what today you might call frenemies. But she did come to the house to explore Day's Keats memorabilia as she was writing her 2-volume biography of the British poet. Finally, to summarize this, I want to share with you, there is a quote, which I once read. Of course, now I can't find it, so I'm going to have to do this a bit by memory. But the quote runs that Norwood never knew what to do with Fred Holland Day. There may well be too much truth in that last statement, even as I personally approach it in the spirit of gallows humor. While the Day family embodied acceptance, responsibility, and community spirit, those traits were not always returned, and Fred's individualism set him up for negative criticism. Now, in terms of broader context also, I want to remind you of trends going on in the Boston area of the day. And one sort of quick way to do that is to remind you of Henry James' 1886 novel, The Bostonians. In this work, he narrates a relationship between two, quote, new women, end quote, of the era. I just want to share with you, as I was assembling the images for this, the cover, the Signet Classic paperback from probably the 80s that you see on the left. This is a cover to the novel. It was really hard to find one that actually showed two women, which is the main portion of the narrative. It was much easier, of course, to get pictures that had nothing to do with the basic plot of the novel. In The Bostonians, Henry James gives us a quintessential example of the so-called Boston marriage, a supportive relationship between two women that was some combination of practical, primarily financial, affective, and possibly, and much depends on the relationship, erotic and sexual. Some think James modeled his novel after the relationship between Sarah Orne Jewett, the writer, and Annie Adams Fields. Recent attention has focused in on Rose Libby Cleveland, who is the sister of US President Grover Cleveland, and her relationship with Evangeline Mars Simpson. They lie together in death. This is a picture of their adjoining monuments in the same plot in Bagni di Lucca, Italy. So you can see, very paired, stylistically close, approximate, related. Now, the fact that Boston marriages were a cultural phenomenon of the day is not to say that sexual relations between women were widely accepted in and around Boston, nor relations between men. What attracted attention were relations beyond a normative marriage. As a member of various dramatic clubs and an extended circle of friends, both male and female, Fred Holliday was very much flying in the face of constraining conventions of the time. Fred's friendships spanned his varied and multiple interests, although most had some artistic bent. Among people who were close to him and influential to him in his circle of friends, first and foremost, Louise Imogen Guiney. She was a poet and a writer. She was Catholic, and Fred plays off of that in the portrait you see here, which is her as Saint Barbara with the halo. I believe that is etched into the negative, not drawn onto the print, but I'm not positive at the moment. She was very much a new woman of the day. For a time, she was postmistress in Auburndale. Based on the extant evidence, there were very close affective ties between Day and Guiney. At the same time, Guiney has been linked to the writer Alice Brown in a so-called Boston marriage, which might have been purely financial. Frequently, the Boston marriages were Brahmin women looking to live together to save money. But as I said, it could be more. Their relationship, Guiney and Brown, it might have been purely financial, but it most likely included intangible support, emotional, possibly affective, but we cannot entirely rule out greater intimacy, including sexual. Another friend and a work colleague is Herbert Copeland. He graduated from Harvard in 1891, and he partnered with Day in the publishing firm of Copeland and Day. Herbert Copeland was possibly gay. Certainly, some letters he wrote to Day read as commentary on the men in Copeland's life. In a lot of ways, Copeland is a difficult figure for me to grasp. He is seemingly both more conservative or less flamboyant than Fred Holliday, and he's also less reticent in his private life. One thing I have pondered and still ponder is that perhaps Copeland was an unhappy person, whereas Fred had made or found his own peace. This is a portrait that Fred took of Herbert Copeland sometime around the year 1900. As with a few of these that I'm going to show you, it is now part of the collection of the Library of Congress, the Louise Imogen Guiney collection. Another friend, Ralph Adams Cram. Cram is a noted American architect, especially for his ecclesiastical and collegiate architecture. He was very much inspired by John Ruskin. If you live in Norwood or visit Norwood and you have been to Highland Cemetery, you've seen the Chapel of St. Gabriel the Archangel, that is a Ralph Adams Cram structure. You can also find buildings by him in Boston, the campus of Princeton University. There are some buildings in Manhattan as well. Locally, He's the architect of the Chapel of St. Gabriel the Archangel. This is a gift of Anna and Louis Smith to the town and also where they lie in repose. One summation of Cram's work holds that, quote, he attempted to create buildings that would convey spiritual values as a corrective to technological civilization. That seems timely even for 2021. According at least to the late Douglas Shantucci, he was gay, his marriage to a woman notwithstanding. In this, as in many regards, Shantucci might be stretching the envelope. Edward Steichen. Steichen is a noted American photographer. He is the first he was a pictorialist, then later expanded his photographic activity into other schools and practices. From 1945 until 1962, he served as director of photography at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He once explained, quote, photography is a medium of formidable contradictions. It is both ridiculously easy and almost impossibly difficult, end quote. I think about that a lot today when we all have cameras on our phones and carry them with us everywhere, and we become a more and more visual culture. But I think Steichen would have a lot more to say about it than I do, but I always feel like that quote still resonates. Another of Fred's friends is Clarence White, another noted American photographer and a photography teacher. He's a man of varied interests and talents. He was soon able to abandon accountancy for a profitable artistic career. One summation of White's work goes as follows. White's work came to public attention in 1898 at the first Philadelphia Photographic Salon. The following year, he was asked to be a judge. White met important figures in American art photography, among them Fred Holland, Gertrude Casabir, Edward Steichen, and Alfred Stieglitz. In 1902, White was a founding member of Photo Secession, promoting pictorialism, and in 1906, the first professor of photography at Columbia University. In 1910, White, along with friends Day, Casabir, and the painter Max Weber, began a summer photography school, first on Saginaw Island, Maine, then later in East Canaan, Connecticut. Clarence White married Jane Felix White, and the White family were close personal friends of Fred Holland. In terms of politics and art, Clarence White, quote, had become a socialist early in his career. He did not consider the camera a tool for social change, but regarded the medium as a means of expressing beauty. This emphasis on beauty and the aesthetics of photography is a huge part of the pictorialist photographic movement. Clarence White's son, Maynard White, I should say Clarence and Jane White's son, Maynard White, was also part of this circle of friends. He was their son. He was a photographic model for Fred Holland. I'll show you a couple of those pictures later on. He attended Brown University, where he was a sprinter on the track team. His college career was interrupted by World War I. During that time, he served as a first lieutenant in the Ohio 43rd Field Artillery CAC in France. After being discharged, he returned to Brown, where he received a BS degree in civil engineering in 1920. He actually used to catch the train up from Providence to Norwood to visit Uncle Fred. He worked as a geologist for the Mexican Eagle Oil Company for a year before entering Columbia University for a master's degree in paleontology. He married Evelyn Ruth Lavers on November 23, 1923, received his PhD in 1929, retired from Gulf Oil Corporation in 1951. A year later, he suffered a stroke from which he never completely recovered. I want to share with you this picture that I love of Fred Holland and Maynard White. Again, this is now at the Library of Congress, part of the Louise Imogen Guiney collection. This is a picture from the island in Maine, where the photo school initially happened, that Clarence White, Day, Casabir, and others ran. In the chalet, they all wore sailor suits. So Fred provided the costumes, flair for the dramatic. So based on their costuming here with these sailors, blouses, jerseys, I'm not entirely sure what the proper name for it is, we can localize this to sometime up in Maine. Curiously, Clarence White, not Maynard shown here, but the father, Clarence, is famed for his portraits of women and domestic scenes. Fred Holland is remembered especially for his portraits of young men and boys. Both photographers did much more work, of course. So how much is this perception rather than reality? That's going to be an ongoing question, especially when we return later to trying to figure out what evidence we can find about Fred Holland's personal life from his photography. But at this point, I want to turn to Khalil Gibran. Having received his primary education in Beirut, Gibran immigrated with his parents to Boston in 1895. He returned to Lebanon in 1898 and studied in Beirut, where he excelled in the Arabic language. He is known as a poet in this country, in English, especially for his work, The Prophet. I am told he is as talented and distinguished as a poet in the Arabic language. I cannot speak to that from personal experience. When he returned to Boston in 1903, he published his first literary essays. Although he's now remembered for his writings, he was also a visual artist and a model for Day. These are two of the three photographs, portraits, I should say, that Fred Holland took of Khalil Gibran. On the left, 1898, so a year after he's immigrated to the Boston area. His family had a fruit stand, and I believe that that's where Fred saw him and asked him to be a model. And then 1898, most likely just before returning to Beirut, where he continued his studies. That's on the right. The visual artistic works of Khalil Gibran were destroyed in the same 1904 fire that claimed Day's photography studio in Boston, so we don't know him as well for his visual art, just as Fred Holland's reputation as a photographer really took quite a hit with the loss of so many items in that studio. Portraits, prints, I should say, as well as negatives. Now, I want to say this is just a portion of the large circle of friends in Fred Holland's life, which I have shared with you. His friends spanned genders, generations, and backgrounds. This is a portrait of a club, the Thetis Therapist Club, which are other friends of Fred's, some of them friends, students, or teachers from Chauncey Hall School. This circle of friends, this very large and evolving, changing circle of friends, offer Day the affective and emotional support of friendship and love. Now, in the classical understanding of friendship, going back to the writings of Cicero and Augustine, there's a happy union of agreement, goodwill, and love. Neither Cicero nor Augustine would include erotic love. Others, and certainly more recent thinkers, would. Now, here's where it becomes difficult to say Fred was gay. In this wide-ranging circle of friends, Fred Holland found the recognition and support of many, and lines or types of friendship blurred. He could indulge a love for flamboyance and theatricality, moving beyond the constraining sartorial and behavioral norms of the day. We see this here with his group of friends known as Visionists. Fred is the second from the right on the stairs going up. This is, for those of you who know it, obviously the Great Hall at the Day House here in Norwood. He could indulge a love for flamboyance and theatricality, moving beyond the constraining sartorial and behavioral norms of the day. There's no single spouse or other central love object central to any understanding of his life. In its way, this alone made Day's personal life suspect, since it did not easily fit into a single category, and it included close association with many artists, those suspect or unsavory characters. Add to that also his varied skills, talents, and changing career path. Now, recall too that the New England Society for the Suppression of Vice, founded 1878, had a membership roster that was, quote, almost a roll call of Boston Brahmin aristocracy, end quote. It was quite active during the same time period as Fred's youth and his photographic career. Renamed the Watch and Ward Society in 1891, it did not dissolve until, or it was not dissolved, I should say, until 1975. One salient anecdote about their efforts. Watch and Ward Society Secretary J. Franklin Chase who was described by the New England Historical Society as, quote, a humorless Methodist minister, end quote, once said, quote, a whole high school class of unwed mothers may be the result of a lascivious book, end quote. I'm sure that inspires you all to make a run to the town library tomorrow morning. In 1926, H.L. Mencken, the American man of letters, shown here on the right, enjoyed sparring against Chase in a libel lawsuit, and he came out victorious. So morality crusades were prevalent in the region during much of the lifetime of our Fred Holland Day. All of this is far from a facile notion of the fin de siècle gay 90s, and it glosses over the early years of the 20th century as well. Returning to Harari's remarks with which I began, history is not a straight line, neither in grand historical narrative nor in cultural norms, perhaps especially in cultural norms. Perhaps no single figure better exemplifies those social, cultural, and moral contradictions than Oscar Wilde, an acquaintance and colleague of Fred Holland Day. Another person of many talents and skills and a varied career, Oscar Wilde is succinctly summarized on the website of the National Portrait Gallery of London as a wit and a dramatist. So he's remembered as a playwright for things such as Lady Windermere's Fan. Why did I remember the most obscure of them to begin with? Or The Importance of Being Earnest. 10 years after the fact, a narrative of a friend's first encounter with the famous author first appears in The Mahogany Tree. The then preacher of aestheticism was discovered placidly waiting with the crowd in a railway station for the gates to open. My friend had just bought at the newsstand a new pencil, hoping to capture an inspiration for his daily theme during the short journey. Armed with the virgin lead and a slip of spotless paper, he approached the unapproachable, and in the sweetest tones his changing voice could assume, requested of the sun's god his autograph. The great one looked down upon the youth with the sunny smile so often and cruelly maligned as incubating, and taking the pencil, slowly traced his name in calligraphy, rather more curious than his appearance. No words escaped the lips of the lily's apostle. Now, no author is attributed to this book's discussion in the Mahogany Tree, and the events are said to concern the author's friend. But many take this account to be written by Day and to narrate his meeting with Wilde. Day was 18, Wilde 28 at the time. Now, in 1889, Day went on to dine with Mr. and Mrs. Oscar Wilde at a dinner party given by Lady Mary Seton. 12 years later, and 2 years after this account is published, in 1894, Day dined with Wilde and Lord Alfred Douglas. That same year of 1894 saw Copeland and Day publish the American edition of Oscar Wilde's Salome, and a longer poem now largely forgotten entitled The Sphinx. By this time, Wilde is the personification of aestheticism and of decadence, and linked to the English decadent movement. Copeland may have been less enamored of these authors than Day. The literary circle of decadence included Aubrey Beardsley, to whom we might be inured today, but in his time he was considered quite scandalous. Here is an oil canvas portrait by Jacques-Émile Blanche of Beardsley on the left. Charles de Soucy Ricketts and Charles Hasselwood Shannon, they were designers. They were founders and publishers of Vale Press. They founded The Dial, an art journal, and they were artistic and lifelong personal partners. Ricketts illustrated Wilde's 1895 poem, The Sphinx. Copeland and Day, here seen in their offices in Boston, published the American edition of Wilde's The Sphinx. So the photo is not in the best of shape, as you can see some of the lines running across it, but that is Copeland on the left and Day on the right. In the meantime, beginning in 1891, Oscar Wilde, aged 38, is associating with Lord Alfred Douglas, aged 22. Here is a portrait of the two of them together from the National Portrait Gallery in London. Douglas's father was John Sholto Douglas, the ninth Marquess of Queensberry. He's remembered for the Queensberry rules of boxing. He did not write them, but he endorsed them, so his name got attached to them. The Marquess was concerned about his son's association with Wilde. He met Wilde in 1892, and for a time he was appeased, and, it would seem, utterly charmed by Wilde. In 1894, however, Queensberry wanted to sever ties between his son and the famous author, and over the course of the next year became more desperate in his attempts. On Valentine's Day 1895, Wilde's play, The Importance of Being Earnest, premiered. Queensberry was blocked from disrupting the show. On the 18th of February in 1895, Queensberry left a note for Wilde at the Albemarle Club inscribed, quote, "To Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite." He did misspell it. In April of 1895, Oscar Wilde filed a libel suit against the Marquess of Queensberry. Wilde lost his case. He was then convicted of sodomy. He delayed too long. He missed the last boat to Paris, so he was apprehended, after all, stood trial, found guilty, served time in Reading jail, and upon being released in 1897, he went into exile in Paris, where he died in 1900. He is buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery. This is one of the more famous of the monuments in the cemetery, and also one of the more frequently defaced, up there with James Morrison, actually. Wilde's reversal of fortune, magnified on a scale, even something that Aristotle could not have imagined. It was utterly complete with his downfall. Now, Wilde's trial has acquired mythic stature in the annals of gay history. The libel lawsuit is also remembered for the discussion of, quote, "the love that dare not speak its name," the ultimate line of a poem written by Douglas and printed in The Chameleon, an Oxford University journal, in December of 1894. You see here from the British Library the cover of this particular issue of The Chameleon. It also included Oscar Wilde's phrases and philosophies for use of the young. This is Douglas's poem. Let me say politely, it is not my choice of poetry. I'm not going to read it all. It goes on. You can find it online easily enough if you wish to read this Two Loves in its entirety. But let's take a look at the conclusion. This is a framework of a dream that the narrator is having. And at the end, the speaker, the person recounting the dream, the dreamer perhaps, addresses this person, this visage, this image. "I pray thee, speak me sooth. What is thy name?" He said, "My name is Love." Then straight the first did turn himself to me and cried, "He lieth, for his name is Shame, but I am Love, and I was wont to be alone in this fair garden till he came, unasked by night. I am true love. I fill the hearts of boy and girl with mutual flame." Then sighing, said the other, "Have thy will. I am the love that dare not speak its name." That phrase has gone on to acquire a huge life of its own that far extends the poem and is known by more people than actually know the text of the poem. It also becomes a key part of the testimony during the libel trial. During the cross-examination by Edward Carson, here abbreviated C, Wilde is interrogated on his literary beliefs. Here is one tantalizing exchange from the stand. Carson, "You read Bloxham's The Priest and the Acolyte." Wilde, "Yes." Carson, "You have no doubt whatever that that was an improper story." Wilde, "From the literary point of view, it was highly improper. It is impossible for a man of literature to judge it otherwise. By literature, meaning treatment, selection of subject, and the like, I thought the treatment rotten and the subject rotten." Carson, "You are of opinion, I believe, that there is no such thing as an immoral book." Wilde, "Yes." Carson, may I take it that you think the priest and the acolyte was not immoral? Wilde, it was worse. It was badly written. It is fascinating to read a legal transcript concerned with propriety, morality, and blasphemy in works of literature. Carson is asking judicial questions. Wilde is responding in some ways like he is still at Oxford doing a tutorial, or he is giving one of his lectures. When Carson asked Wilde if Bloxam's story was blasphemous, Wilde replied, I think it violated every artistic canon of beauty. He went on to say, the story filled me with disgust. The end was wrong. And finally, I thought it disgusting. While Carson took that last as confirmation, one can't help but feel Wilde and Carson were speaking incompatible languages. Both use a moral vocabulary, but words carry a different weight in the legal and aesthetic conversations which clash here. In its way, this perfectly illustrates the linguistic codes, such as most famously Polari, which allowed coded conversation on gay themes to pass unnoticed in larger circles of daily life. Polari, it's defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as a form of slang incorporating Italianate words, rhyming slang, cant terms, other elements of vocabulary. The OED gives citations going back to 1846. Other sources date Polari back at least to 1700. There's also a great BBC article, Polari, the code language gay men used to survive, that shows how you could have a conversation in front of someone that would be innocuous. It would not find you on trial, as Oscar Wilde was, but it would allow you to confirm if you were talking to another gay man. There apparently exists now an app which you can download to your phone. I haven't played around with it. It allows you to read the King James Bible in its entirety in Polari. There is also a British comedian who did a long-running comedy show using Polari as well. But I bring up Polari because I feel like it is another code where words go at cross purposes or conversations fly over one another, very much like Carson and Wilde at this trial. The portion of Wilde's legal proceedings illustrates the struggle for artistic freedom when it stands in conflict or opposition to commonplace social constraints and morals. That, I think, defined a lot of Oscar Wilde's art and life and is relevant to Fred Holland Day as well. Now, Wilde's trial and subsequent demise cast a chill on any sense of liberation or openness that the so-called gay 90s might have inspired. This deadly suppression continued until the Wolfenden Report, which was published on the 4th of September 1957, and finally the Sexual Offences Act of 1967, which decriminalized homosexual acts between men aged 21 or over in private. Those are both British items. The legal status in the United States, in fact, changes somewhat later, and there are more complications in Britain as well, but I don't want to sort of get into all of that. It would sort of take too long and derail us. But the point being is, for the duration of Fred Holland Day's life, Oscar Wilde's life, homosexuality was a criminal offense. The pall of the Wilde trial is not just limited to prosecutions, although also persecutions. It impacted daily lives, and it led to many men being blackmailed, either for their sexual acts or for their perceived sex acts. This enforced moral crusade ensnared many, and among others, cost us the life and brilliance of Alan Turing, father of modern computing and World War II codebreaker extraordinaire. You may know more about him now because of the recent film The Imitation Game, which focused a lot of attention on that. And finally, a posthumous pardon being issued by the British government to some extent. Wilde's trial and his being found guilty, his being jailed, was one prominent cudgel among many to enforce normative sexual behavior for the following 60 plus years. Now I'm returning to this picture of the Athena's Therapist Club meeting at the Day House, shown here. In 1885, 2 years before this portrait, 3 years after first meeting Wilde, 21-year-old Fred Holland Day experienced an early, we believe it was his first, and important infatuation with another member of the AT Club, John or Jack Bemis. Meeting through their membership in this club, their correspondence flourished between April 1885 and roughly February 1886. Day mentions Bemis for the last time. Sorry, let me start that over again. Bemis married on June 29, 1887, a little over a year after the end of their correspondence. And in a letter written on that same date to his friend Anna Frothingham, Day mentions Bemis for the last time. From infatuation to jealousy to resignation in the face of loss, Fanning observes this has the arc of a lover scorned. In 1898, 34-year-old Day met the artist Thomas Langryl Harris, aged 21. Much about Harris's life is unclear, perhaps deliberately so. He grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and he left there in 1897 for Canada and New York. He arrived in Boston in December 1898. He was charismatic, but he also rubbed many the wrong way. He may have been something like a grifter. Certainly there were such allegations. By the middle of 1899, Harris is in England. In 1900, Harris and Day met up again in England, and later that year traveled together to Paris. On the 11th of January 1901, the self-styled Langryl Harris committed suicide by jumping into the Seine River. As Fanning notes, quote, the date of Harris's death was noted as 11 January 1901 in Fred Holland Day's line-a-day diary for the years 1922 to 1926. And this practice of marking, quote, the anniversary of the young artist's death in his diary each year with a notation he saved only for close family and intimate acquaintances, end quote, attests to the depth of feeling Day had for Harris. Corroboration of the emotional ties between the two men come from subsequent letters to Day from Louise Imogen Guiney and Edward Steichen. In 1901, Guiney wrote to Day, quote, I'm sorry you had the painful burden of it all, adding, and I am sorry for the beautiful boy. Steichen wrote to Day 5 years later, in 1906, wanting to borrow works by Harris, noting that, quote, I know you treasure these things not only for their artistic worth, end quote, and apologizing, quote, if I have hurt you by asking for something so sacred to you, end quote. So not only was there an intimate relationship between Day and Harris, whether or not sexual, it was acknowledged by Day's close friends. Now, in this talk so far, I've presented a lot of points. Let's see if we can connect them to paint a picture. Harris commits suicide in Paris 42 days after the death of Oscar Wilde, also in Paris. This feels a symbolic and important connection, and it may not be rational, but rather emotional, affective, or spiritual. It is certainly a tragic end to a life, to any life. While it is possible to posit many reasons for Harris's suicide, it's worth including one salient fact. Even the most talented and wealthy of homosexuals could be destroyed by society in the then new 20th century. Harris may not have been on a par with Wilde, but the demise of the sun's god, the unapproachable one, had far-reaching ramifications. Many issues or converging currents might have led to Harris's act of suicide, but I would absolutely include among those reasons the difficulty, if not utter impossibility, of finding his place of comfort and support, his happy ending, if you will, in the world of his day and the stories society told him for his life and his future. Harris's suicide marked Day's life for the following decades, for arguably the rest of Day's own life. It becomes an indelible part of Fred Holland Day's own story in the years to come. As Fanning noted with the marks in Day's diary, this is a circumspect or constrained grief, shared among close friends and associates, but only addressed obliquely, out of necessity if one wanted to remain alive. Acts of repression, of suppression, weigh heavily on us all. So far, we have reviewed some of the circumstantial evidence of Fred Holland Day's friends, and also the written evidence, reticent though it be. The other body of evidence for answering questions about Fred's sexuality are his photographs. Reading artworks for signs of sexual orientation is an imprecise exercise at best, something like a game of chercher l'homosexuel. Roberts offers a succinct review of how the argument typically runs. Day never married, and his sexual orientation, whilst it is widely assumed that he was homosexual because of his interests, his photographic subject matter, his general flamboyant demeanor, was, like much else about him, a very private matter. Many highlight photos that Fred took of youth. This usually becomes a morality crusade worthy of the humorless Reverend Chase and his Watch and Ward Society. This also overlooks artistic trends and is predicated on the human body, an interest in and appreciation of it being inherently somewhat suspect. Consider the following artistic trends and influences which also mark Day's photography, and also let's consider the following slides a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of Fred Holland Day's extant photographs. First, there's an emphasis on drapery. One example shown here. This harkens back to ancient Greek sculpture or Renaissance art, sculpture or painting. It's about the play of light and shadow across the drapery. So it's an implicit argument for arguing that photography is on a par with acknowledged and elevated art forms of the day, such as painting and sculpture. And that was a key argument of photography as a new medium in the latter 19th century, something that Fred Holland Day wrote about himself. And it was also a key component of the pictorialist movement in their arguments for the value of photography as a high art form. There's an emphasis on the human body, especially the human body, but ultimately any body. This platinum print of a nude youth in the studio draws very much on classical sculpture, the form, the pose, the modeling. There's an emphasis on physicality. You see a lot of this in Catholic artwork. Here, Day is drawing directly on the Catholic iconography of the Saint Sebastian, the martyred Saint Sebastian, who is patron saint of disease and also in many contexts of homosexuals that came to the fore in the 1980s and 90s during the height of the AIDS pandemic. We also can see physicality in Day's religious photography. I chose not to include the 7 Last Words, assuming that you all know it. If you don't know it, you should go and look at 7 Last Words. There is an extant copy of it in the MFA in Boston. There's the constant use of classical references as well to claim a pedigree of value for photography as an art form. We see that in Ebony and Ivory, this 1897 photograph. This is a copy held by the Art Institute Chicago. Let me just point out that the model here is identified now as J.R. Carter. I just want to reiterate, I want to put the lie to, I want to put to bed a lie that crops up over and over again, that Alfred Tannehill was a model for Fred Holland Day. That is a misidentification, and a lot of the African-American or Black models that you will see in Day's photographs have been now quite recently identified. Another is J. Alexander Skeet. And if you want to know more about that, I encourage you to look up references to the exhibit in Boston, which was up last year in 2020, called Boston's Apollo. And it explores the entire cadre of professional Black models that existed in and around Boston at that time and were used by artists such as Day or Sargent, famously. There's also classical models that don't involve bodies. I should say I don't actually trust myself to be able to go back the way this is behaving on my computer. But that previous image, and I'll show this again in another one, is also about playing with light and shadow and contrast. And there's a lot of technical skill that goes into the photography of the day and being able to generate the quality of and the depth of imagery that the light and shadow reveal in what you see here. But in classical references, you also see using classical statuary, as we saw on the last slide, or as we see here with the cast of Michelangelo's Dying Slave. It's a bit of a small one. It's a funny play with angles here. It's shot against the pergola in the background of Little Good Harbor, Maine, which is where White, Casimir Day, and others ran their summer photography school and where Day spent time in the summers. A couple more pictures as well from Maine. Here's Fred in a sort of flowing piece of drapery, again, the use of drapery, reading from a scroll, seated in front of a herm. This is classical statuary. It's a sort of portrait bust on a plinth. About where Fred's shoulder is, a proper ancient Greek herm would have had, as art historians call it, the iphthallic member, an erect penis. These were sacred to the god Hermes, erected at crossroads to scare away bad and evil things. I'm not entirely sure of the head on this particular herm. I haven't managed to figure that one out quite yet. And on the right, this is just a portrait of Fred in the dining room at the Little Good Harbor in Maine. And in the background, if you can see my cursor, you can see it above the chair and the table. Again, another little cast of classical statuary. Again, playing with the pictorials tradition and concerns about the value of photography as a high art form. I also want to just talk about briefly Fred's so-called gaslight photos. And I realize that now I actually have to stop and identify that term. We have talked in recent years about gaslighting in a very different way. In Fred's lifetime, there was a shift from gas lighting in houses to electrical lighting. If you go into the day house, you will notice a lot of the light fixtures are dual gas and electric. There's a changing quality of light. There's a flickering, there's a play with shadow, there's an inconsistency that gaslight gives that you don't get from electrical light. You might, if you watched Downton Abbey, have noticed an allusion when the Dowager Countess says somewhere early on in one of, I think, her first appearances, she finds the electrical light too blinding. She feels like she's on stage at the Gaiety. It's playing off of this distinction, this difference between the quality of light. In photos such as this, Coastal Landscape with Dock, Fred is taking the photographic medium and especially the albumin or platinum printing that he loved, which is known for its precision and its clarity. And he's trying to capture that imprecision of gaslight, that variability. So it's a very difficult technical thing to do, which he does here. And you see it again in the fuzziness, the imprecision of this 1909 picture, a photograph of a wooden bridge, again at Little Good Harbor. There are two men, Shikachiro Tsuboi and Kiichiro Matsuke. Please remember Kiichiro Matsuke. I'm going to return to him at the end. So again, roughly 1909 in this photograph. A nice summation of the artistic and the aesthetic trends and influences, goals and projects that Fred Holliday undertook comes from this quote by Gleason White. If you can find a really beautiful model, post it among suitable environments, arrange the lighting dexterously, secure the balance of tone so that the hair is not too dark in juxtaposition with the flesh, and infuse the artistic instinct of selection, accentuating certain points, ignoring others, the result might be a thing of genuine beauty. Many of these issues come to the fore in pictorialism, as there is a struggle for photography to find its place as a fine art. I'm going to leave you to look at this slide for a few minutes. This is one of Fred Holliday's most famous works, Beauty is Truth, Truth Beauty, dating to 1896. It takes its title from John Keats, a hero and a personal touchstone for Fred Holland, in his Ode on a Grecian Urn. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know. Curtis offers a summation that highlights the ambiguity and the difficulty of answering questions of Day's sexuality based on artwork. Quote, though he was in touch with homosexual artists and writers of his day, and he photographed young, beautiful, and dreamy male subjects, sometimes in the nude, he was not obsessed with the homoerotic, end quote. Now, I would qualify that Day was in touch with manifest or obviously homosexual artists and writers of his day. He took a portrait of Edward Carpenter, who was an early homosexual activist. He probably interacted with the two Charleses, the designers of the English decadence movement, who illustrated Wilde's The Sphinx. Obviously, he knew Oscar Wilde. He dined with him. There was some degree of familiarity there, as well as Day being Wilde's American publisher. Day's own life experiences, however, led him to a reticence and a privacy which shroud the details of his sexuality in the darkness of a closet, perhaps an enforced rather than a chosen closet. In Wilde, as in Keats, another hero of his, Day found an exemplar of art for art's sake, one who pursued beauty as its own goal. With the changing mores, the high price and the jeopardy of espousing or embracing or even flirting with decadence, Day kept aspects of his personal life private. We talk today a lot about people being introverted or extroverted. There's a four-letter matrix for describing a personality type. I don't understand it, so I'm not even going to go there. In a lot of ways, Day was theatrical and flamboyant, as we have seen. He enjoyed costuming, he enjoyed outlandish garb. But I think of Day in some ways as an extroverted introvert. There is a core of privacy to him, to his life, certainly about his sexuality. And I think some of that is just his response to the life and times he lived in and his own lived experiences or the experiences of those he knew and those around him. With Curtis's quote in mind, it is also worth reflecting on Fred Holland-Day's life more broadly. We've not touched on his role as a local historian or genealogist. His work still forms a core of the archives of the Nord Historical Society. We've said nothing about his depth of knowledge and indeed his collection of letters and items relating to the British Romantic poet John Keats. Most of this material, not all, but most, went to the Keats House Museum in 1933 in London. Day was learned about other authors too, including Balzac. We've barely mentioned his work as a highly regarded publisher of art books and have said nothing about his bibliomania. He was a member of the Odd Volumes Club in Boston, which I believe still exists. We have not discussed his philanthropy. Fred Holland-Day was a protean figure with manifold talents. More than a dilettante or amateur, he was a polymath. He excelled in multiple fields over the course of his lifetime. As with his circle of friends that we looked at earlier, his varied occupations and skills make him hard to pin down as he pushed societal boundaries and, using the parlance of today, he kept reinventing himself. In reflecting on Fred Holland-Day, his times, his life, and his art, I find myself recalling E.M. Forster's novel Morris. Written in 1913-1914, it was only published posthumously in 1971, and it is dedicated to a happier year. The novel depicts conflict over one man's attraction to other men, initially Morris Hall, those who are willing to conform to societal expectations, the character Clive Durham, and men of limited means who are nonetheless freer to be true to themselves, the character of Alec Scudder. The parting between Durham and Hall recalls the parting between Day and Jack Bemis. While Morris and Alec find their lifelong happiness only outside the pages of the book, Forster kept trying to write the happy ending, and there's a postscript about how he ultimately always found it unsatisfactory. So it's hinted at. It is the happier year that he hoped for, but perhaps even he could not imagine. While Morris and Alec find their lifelong happiness outside the pages of the book, Fred did not have that luxury. Certainly, he retreated into his books. And in that regard, he's part of a long tradition in Victorian literature and culture of finding the homosexual in the library. But unlike Forster's characters, who find their affective and emotional fulfillment in a united duality, exit stage right, Fred Holland found his affective and emotional fulfillment in a large circle of friends and acquaintances, many of whom remembered him with great fondness. So much of the impropriety that people claim to find in Fred Holland's life comes from the discomfort of contemporary journalists looking to sell broadsheets with scandal and innuendo, or from later people trying to understand his life and usually revealing far more about their own assumptions and attitudes, their own limited horizons of expectation and understanding. In conclusion, I want to leave us with the words of Kiichiro Matsuke. He was one of the two gentlemen on the bridge in the 1909 gaslit portrait that I showed you a few slides back. He was a friend of Fred Holland since 1900, and he was the owner of the Shobisha print shop in Tokyo. He wrote to the Norwood Messenger after Fred's passing, and thank you to Hillary and the resources of the Moral Memorial Library. I can show you what this looks like on the page. The issue of Friday, the 9th of February, 1934, initially seen on the left on page 1, continues farther in the inside. He was a most kind and thoughtful person and often sent remembrances to my family. His death brought to us a great grief. Indeed. Thank you all for your time and attention. And I hope you've enjoyed this quick look at some of Fred's life, but also some of Fred's photographs. Sorry about that. Once the Norwood Historical Society reopens, I invite you all to come to the Day House. You can see the house. You have seen glimpses of it in the background of some of these pictures. And I would be very happy to take any questions you might have. I'm going to stop the screen share. And I might even be able to see the chat. Any questions? Wayne, that you're unmuted. There you go.
It's Wayne Perkins. I'm sorry I arrived late because I had a previous commitment. Catherine, that was a wonderful lecture. It was a wonderful lecture. It explored many things about the gentleman that I was unaware of, and also to put it in context to the society that he was dealing with. I think it was quite excellent. I'm quite surprised how wonderful these photographs are. I mean, they really are extraordinary. And congratulations.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you very much. It is one of the great tragedies that so many of his photographs were lost in the studio fire in Boston. And the other reason that I think he is not so widely known as a photographer, there's the sort of the paucity of photographs, the great loss, but also there's the massive falling out with Alfred Stieglitz. I have to say, Stieglitz, I don't think he's a very nice man. And others have said that. And if I'm remembering correctly, he was actually married to Georgia O'Keeffe. Talk about an explosive marriage. Hard to fathom. But Stieglitz wound up really writing a lot of the narrative of the history of photography. And that helped push Fred aside. So Fred is, frankly, overdue for being returned to his rightful place in that history. He was a vital and an important part of that early history, and I think it's worth acknowledging that. So I'm glad you enjoyed it, Wayne. You can actually see a lot of these if you can navigate the Library of Congress website. A lot of them were donated as part of the Louise Imogen Guiney collection. That was an anonymous donation, but everyone now knows that it was Fred. He didn't want it known. It's been revealed. Same with the gift to Keith's house, actually. But it's a great way to see a lot of them. And you can also go to DC when we can travel again and actually admire them in person. It is hard to see the depth in these photographs. I will tell you, we have one gaslight photograph, a portrait in the Day House that we can show you if you come visit. The rest are reproductions. It's a 1922 portrait that Fred took of his mother, Anna Smith Day, a couple of years before she died. And it really does capture this precision of a face and this imprecision of blurred lines. It's really fabulous. I could not share it with you today. I tried desperately to get an image of it to share with you. There was no way to photograph it. All I got was the glare off of the glass, and I didn't want to unframe it. So you would have seen like my camera, me, anything reflecting. I put it in a dark room. It did not matter. I could not capture it. So I can at least show you that in person. But when it goes back on display too, you really should go to the MFA to see the 7 last words. I see a question in the chat from Joyce and Jimmy asking if Fred Holland was familiar with Edward Perry Warren and his entourage at, you think, Lou's house. You know, one of the huge questions that I'm still grappling with in a number of ways is how do we connect Fred Holland with the larger circle of influential artists, aesthetes, art historians, art collectors in Boston. As we here in town know, Norwood is 12 miles as the crow flies, 15 depending on who you ask or which monument you're going to peg it to from Boston. But there is a world of difference in some ways between them. I know that Fred knew Bernard Berenson, who was the artistic advisor to Isabel Stewart Gardner. You saw him at the Day House in that AT Club photograph that I showed you from 1887. He went on to be like a really central figure in the history of art history in America and was gay. But, you know, to what extent there's overlap there. I'm still trying to figure out if there was direct connection between Fred Holland and Isabella Stewart Gardner. All I can say to answer this question is Day would have been familiar with Edward Perry Warren as a person, as a collector, as someone who really created so much of the core, especially of the Japanese or Asian art collection at the Museum of Fine Arts. I don't know what the connections were beyond that. It's an ongoing question. I have to believe there was connection there, and I have to believe there's more than we probably know. One of the constant struggles is what happened that we don't know because we just don't have the written record or the traces for it. I always think back to A.S. Byatt's novel Possession at the end. You may recall this is the novel that moves back and forth between two poets in the Victorian period and scholars researching them in the contemporary period. And we as readers know things that happened in the Victorian period that are completely lost to the archival or historic or archival or historic records because there was no trace. There's no writing to attest to it, so you can't prove anything. And I'm afraid that the Warren and Day connection may fall in that category. But if I find anything, check our blog at the Day site, at the Day House, or historical. Sorry, let me try that again. Check our blog at the Norwood Historical Society's website. I'll be sure to share something. Marguerite asks, do we know whether Fred did his own photo printing or at least spent time in the darkroom with whoever actually did the printing? It seems he would have been unlikely to have given up control of the final processing. Absolutely, Marguerite, he was very particular about the techniques, the processing, the medium. He lost his taste for photography when certain papers and processing techniques were no longer readily accessible. I do not have the technical information to answer that fully and firmly. But I know that it has been researched very extensively. by a friend of the society and a sort of scholar at Fred Holland Day who works down in DC with the collection. I'm going to tell you imprecisely, take it with a grain of salt. Absolutely, he spent time in the darkroom, and absolutely, he did some of his own printing. There was no way, especially in that time, that period, to move away from that knowledge. There's just too much that you would be losing control over. And since especially that finished product was so crucial to him, and the constant play, as we see with the gaslit photographs of trying to maintain precision and imprecision, he had to have a hand in the darkroom with that. I think he must have. So take my absolute certainty with your nearest can of Morton salt or other brand of choice, because I don't have the list of evidence in front of me to answer that. Oh, this is a fascinating question from Peter. Do I know if Fred Holland Day had any contact with Julia Margaret Cameron? I don't. I think he must have from his visits to London, but I can't document it. Oh, let me see if I'm doing this correctly. Julia Margaret Cameron was Virginia Woolf's aunt, famous female photographer in Britain in the 19th century. And I believe I have correctly identified her in a larger genealogy, so it put her adjacent to the Bloomsbury group. And yes, there really is a great play there in the photography. There's another one of these plays with precision and imprecision and the sort of gaslit quality. I will look into this a little bit more. Thank you very much for that question. If you don't know Julia Margaret Cameron's photographs, do go look them up. They are worth knowing. They're really, really beautiful.
Cashman, can I ask a
Matthew.
question about sort of either Curtis's writings on Day's sexuality or what we know about his publishing? Because I'm very curious if there's any insight into whether or not Day was prolific in sort of the writings of popular sexologists at the time, like Ellis, Robinson, Kraft Ebing, because I found particularly that image where he's pulling from the religious iconography of Saint Sebastian, where there's obviously a homoeroticism to that religious iconography, but also the choosing of Saint Sebastian, the patron saint of sort of this saintly death, at a time in which sexuality is now transitioning from sort of a purely religious context to this struggle between a religious one and a pathological one. So I found it quite interesting that within that image, he also blended those two themes, and was just curious to know if he's sort of playing around in his head with the religious and the medical at this time.
I think that's a brilliant question, Matthew. I think there's a connection there. I don't know if it is based on direct knowledge or indirect knowledge. One image I did not show you is a portrait. It's almost one of these photos that Fred Holland Day took of Edward Carpenter. So he clearly had some personal interactions with Edward Carpenter. So he would have known a lot of these ideas, if not directly, then indirectly. The Saint Sebastian picture is 1906. I don't think I'm now sharing with you the horrible state of the desktop of my computer, but I'm trying to quickly go and check the Carpenter photograph because I think it is around the same time, which would be even stronger indirect or circumstantial evidence for the connection that you're looking for there, Matthew. And of course, there's so much junk on my computer and so many strangely named files, I can't actually immediately answer the question. I think it's within a year. I think the Carpenter carte de visite is 1905, 1906. So that would put it within a year of the Saint Sebastian portrait, or photograph. So I think I would say there absolutely has to be a connection. I just can't say if it's a direct connection that he knew the books and he read the books, or if it's indirect that he knew the ideas because he discussed them or encountered them conversationally.
It could even be subconscious. You're just thinking about it, but it's not intentional.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, remember, this is also the high period of Freud. So yes, let's
Mhm.
not forget the subconscious.
Yeah. Thank you, Cashman.
No, well, thank you. Thank you very much for that question. That was a great one. Other questions? I want to thank you for your patience. I think when I started this, I said it was probably going to be barely 20 minutes long. And then I kept adding more and more images and fleshing things out in more and more detail. So I appreciate your patience in sticking to it for the full duration. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I have one last follow-up, just because you mentioned
Sure.
Stieglitz. So is there a connection between Day specifically and Georgia O'Keeffe? Because she was also very good friends, obviously based out west, but she was very good friends with many questionably homosexual artists. One who comes to mind is the precisionist painter Charles Demuth, whom she visited in Lancaster many times. So I was wondering if she ever perhaps visited Norwood and sat down with Day.
That, to the best of my knowledge, no, there is no connection there. I would love to find that. I mean, Matthew, of course, it's the great challenge, right? About even with Georgia O'Keeffe, trying to say, what was her sexuality? Who was she involved with sexually or erotically? I kind of chuckle, and I started chuckling when you asked the question, because I always, in my mind, I flash back to the Robert Mapplethorpe photograph of the sculptor Louise Bourgeois. And it's, I think, her in her 80s. She lived, I think, to well over 100 and only died about 10 years ago, 11 years ago. But it's a picture of Louise Bourgeois with this fabulous smirk on her face. And she's holding one of her sculptures under her arm. And I think it's entitled something like Rabbit. But you look at it and it looks like the ithyphallic member that's missing from the herm, shall we say, oversized at that. In fact, I wonder if I cannot completely crash things. Let me see if I can quickly call up this Mapplethorpe photograph to share with you. But it gets exactly to this question about mining art for a clue to an artist or a portrait. A portraitist, someone who sits for a portrait, a person who is photographed, their sexuality. And the interplay really seems to me to come down to especially her smirk, right? The facial expression. And she's just really driving home this challenge of trying to answer these kinds of questions based on artwork, artwork in any form. I am going to share this. So this is probably the not safe for work version of the presentation. But this is the portrait in question, this 1982 photograph. And it just really, to me, brings home the challenges of trying to answer questions about a person's life based on an artwork. And it's also worth including Mapplethorpe here. Had I gone on even longer in the completely interminable version of this talk, we could have explored contemporary photographers today who are inspired by Day's work and remain inspired by Day's work. Robert Mapplethorpe is one. I mean, he is no longer with us. He's not contemporary in that sense, but he was very much inspired by F. Holland Day. There are younger photographers as well, one of whom has come and sort of shot photographs in the Day House, and we're hoping to have a display of those at some point in the near future. A young photographer named Lissa Rivera. So it's part of an ongoing continuum. Thank you for indulging me in my love of that Mapplethorpe portrait of Louise Bourgeois. But Matthew, I've never found any direct relationship or connection between Day and O'Keeffe, but it would be fabulous. And it's still possible that it may well have existed. We do know that, for instance, Amy Lowell came out to Fred's library to inspect his Keatsiana when we were putting together the exhibit on the Tannehill and Diggs families. There's a memory, an oral history recording of Anne Tannehill. She was there that day, and they were setting up the library room, and Amy Lowell was a large woman, and of course always looks larger because of the clothes of the time, circa 1907. And Fred Holland was a mischievous man. He had Anne Tannehill remove all the chairs from the room and put only the smallest seated chairs around, so that that's all that Amy Lowell could sit in when she showed up to look at these things that Fred both wanted to share, but also didn't really want to share with her for her 2-volume Keats biography. So there's this constant play, and maybe a love of secrets and a bit of mischievousness that complicates some of these seemingly straightforward requests or research questions.
Mm-hmm.
There's a story about that particular visit that Fred, realizing that Amy was a very large woman, had one particular chair specially reinforced so that when she sat on it, she would not be embarrassed by crashing to the floor. And I think it's one of those chairs that has it's in the Historical Society, but it has a leg in the middle where you'd sit. It's an armchair. And it's
Yes.
in the Historical Society collection.
I have wondered about that leg.
That's why.
But it is also tiny, and I believe it has little arms on the side, so it would be remarkably uncomfortable to sit in as well.
I didn't think he wanted her to be particularly comfortable. He just didn't want her to be embarrassed.
Well, but I think it was apparently the both. If we go with Anne Tannehill's story, it was like a bit of inflicting discomfort on Amy Lowell, but yes, also not too much, limiting how much.
Exactly. But there are many stories about Fred and his generosity in the community, and how he gave Mrs. Everett some flowers, then had Mr. Tannehill go over and plant them in February. And she said, "But Mr. Tannehill, this is the wrong time of year to plant them." He said, "No, Mr. Day said this is the right time." She said, "Well, put them over there." And he did, and they came up beautifully. So there are a number of those kinds of stories around about him. In other words, he was not embittered by the rejection, if you will, by some people in the community. He was, in fact, willing to engage with them, and he was a good guy if you're, overlook the rest of the things that people thought were weird.
Absolutely, Marguerite, and thank you for that. Thank you for those anecdotes. They're both kind of priceless additions. And as I said, I didn't really talk about Fred as a philanthropist at all. He and his parents were hugely important philanthropists to the town of Norwood. But there was also, great personal generosity. It was more Anna Smith Day who bought Alfred Tannehill and his family a house. So, gave them a house. In Fred's will, Alfred Tannehill was given a sum of money every year till he died. It was like almost an annuity payment type situation. So there were these sort of acts of generosity. There was the generousness when he gave his art to collections that it really enhanced, like the Keats House Museum in London, for example. The fact that he wanted that to be anonymous, the fact that he gifted to the Library of Congress a huge trove of material anonymously, but he wanted it remembered in the name of Louise Imogen Guiney, his dear friend, and he wanted to immortalize her, not himself. And that's very much who he was. There are ways that the town of Norwood, I think, forgets how much of our own history we owe to the work of Fred Holland Day. The list of veterans that's inscribed in Town Hall, that was produced by Fred Holland Day late in life when they were building Memorial Hall in 1928, 1929. As I said, the historical core of our archives, the genealogical records, Fred's research. There are historic items from the region, which Fred himself collected. In our collection, we have a little catalog of antiquities that he hand-pinned as a 7-year-old boy, still in the Day House, and many of the items still in the Day House. So, there was this love of community, this connection with his fellow humans that he never lost, even if there were setbacks in his personal life. And I think he is a remarkable figure, and in a lot of different ways, not just as a photographer, but it's been a pleasure to share some of those ways with you all.
Okay, so we are at 8:30. So I just want to say thank you to everybody on behalf of the library for attending tonight. It was wonderful to see all of you, host all of you, and I hope that you have a wonderful evening. And thanks again to the Friends for sponsoring this. And of course, thanks again to Cashman for the very informative presentation.
Thank you all for joining. I greatly appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you all at the Day House when we're able to reopen in the fall after we put in our accessible entrance ramp and our public restroom. So please come, and we'll have even more events and opportunities to show you more about Fred Holland Day, the Day family, and Norwood history.
Thanks, Cashman.
Thank you, Cashman.
Well done.
Thank you all.